Here are the 10 best ARC items. In at number 10, we've got the fabricated pistol, a nice little pistol device that does a healthy amount of damage when you inflict it on a target. I think it's a pretty reasonable weapon just for getting a lot of things done, and considering the bullets aren't too expensive and it's one of the cheaper options from the fabricator, I think it makes a great weapon. Perhaps not against Gacha Claws, we can't harm him, but against any just unwary enemy that gets in your way, the fabricated pistol is a great weapon to use in where you can just take down whatever you want, really, and it does the job. It gets the job done. Potentially not as good as some of the other guns on our list today, but it does a good healthy amount of damage, and again, the bullets are cheap and you can't really complain with that. Next up, we've got the good old harpoon launcher with those nets attached. I think it is a great way of taking out some creatures and starting to tame them, because, you know, the bowler only works up to a certain point for creatures, but the net gun is great for everything and it gets them all down. Big creatures or small creatures, it has really made taming so much easier and so much more efficient. Of course, you have to be wary of timings, but considering the harpoon launcher is also useful for a few other things, although now I think is obviously most used for these net projectiles, I think it is a very good weapon to have in your roster, especially if you like your taming. And I think personally a lot of us like our taming, and also if you've got pesky compy following you, you can simply net those things down and get away no problem. Of course you can use a bowler as well, but where's the fun in that, right? You can test out your new net gun and start netting everything. Originally you'd have to use things like chain bowlers, but as you can see, this is so much more compact and efficient than the chain bowler, and you know that would only work for bigger creatures. The net projectile works on any sort of medium-sized creature as well, which is a step up from the bowler for sure, and you don't have to be an insanely high level to start using that. You can see I took that Kano down, and now it's Gacha's dinner, but you know, we'll leave that Kano alone. I'm sure it's having a great time. Coming up next, we've got the simple, humble spear, and you know, what can really go wrong with a spear in the early game, because we are covering the 10 best weapons, and although perhaps this isn't the highest when it comes to durability and damage dealing, there's no doubt that in the early game it is a very, very useful weapon, as it is an extremely cheap one to make and offers good solutions in tackling enemies. And it's also not too bad for gathering up meat as well. You can see we are gathering a pretty healthy sum there with the spear, of course, and I think, you know, it really does work its weight for the level you're at. Obviously, you're not going to be using this thing into the late game, but in the early game stages, this is really one of your main lines of defense, and it works really effectively for that. You can even throw it and cover a long amount of range too. I think the spear is a perfect little device for running around and getting the job done in the early stages of the game, of course, because you really can get so much done with a spear. And although you're not going to be using it in the late game, of course, I think it is invaluable in the early game, and that's why I put it on the list. Next up, though, we have got the bow and arrow, and possibly this is the upgrades to the spear in the early game, as it covers a longer range and can do quite a bit more damage than something like a spear if used effectively. I think considering it's a level 10 item as well, it does pack a little bit more than the spear and is obviously more useful. But I'm not just putting the normal bow on the list. The compound bow works wonders as well, and although a dilo is a small target, it still does work very effectively, and you can see that mass amount of damage which has been dealt through with that. The compound bow is definitely an upgrade to the bow, although not many people's favorites and not really a preferred weapon to use. I still think it is good with the bow as well on top of it, because you're going to be using the bow in the early game, but I do like the compound bow in the late game. I think it works wonders for taking out some things when you don't want to use a gun. And I think that is where the compound bow is most effective in use, but mainly the bow is what we're talking about here. And they have the added benefit of trank arrows. And obviously with trank arrows, you can start to knock out creatures as well, which is better than just the previous mentioned damage dealing, which we've got from the previous weapons. Now you can also start taming your dinos up as well, which I think adds to the whole thing too. Where as a weapon which is just used for fighting is great, a weapon that can also be used for taming is perhaps even greater in the long run. You could just absolutely pelt arrows into this raptor and hopefully it can become your new friend. Another jack of all trades when it comes to weapons is the long neck, which we've got here, and this of course works with your normal standard bullet, but it can also be used with trank arrows, which I think perhaps even makes it more effective as well. If it was just a generic gun, then I wouldn't put it so highly on the list. But with the advantage of trank arrows and then later on shocking tranquilizer darts, and although yes, they're more expensive, they are still very effective and are definitely much more effective for knocking things out. And they're sort of the pinnacle of what you're going to be using to knock things out. They deal so much torpor with each shot. It is insane what you can get out of these shocking tranks versus something like a trank arrow which you get from a bow. It is by far the most effective way of knocking out a creature, and obviously with the added gun capabilities as well, you can add a scope and do all things like that. It is great for sniping and general combat too, and considering its durability is quite high, there definitely isn't anything lost going out and shooting some stuff with the long neck. Now, possibly controversially, we have got the crossbow, and the reason why I put this higher than the long neck is also the fact that it can be used underwater. It's much cheaper than the long neck, and again, still has that same use in normal arrows and metal arrows on top of all of it as well. While the compound bow deals far more damage and obviously can use trank arrows, it lacks on the durability side of things, and of course doesn't work underwater. Of course, the harpoon launcher is great for underwater tames as well. I think the crossbow is usually the way that I go, and I think the way many others go in this department as well. I think compared to a lot of other items in the game, the crossbow is by far used by more people, and particularly is effective as well, considering its low cost and the fact that you can use those tranks and normal arrows on top of everything else too. And of course, they work underwater, as I've already mentioned, and this does make them effective combating tools, as who doesn't want to use this amazing crossbow, which also works underwater if you're doing any underwater taming, perhaps sneaking up on this Spino and start going for it. It really does make the crossbow very versatile, which is what I can't say about some of the other weapons on this list, but that's why I've ranked it up so highly. Perhaps my favorite melee weapon item is the pike, and this truly is what it is for me. The pike is far superior to the spear, and of course if you go up and you get an ascended one of these things too, it can work even better for all of your arc fighting needs. Just go up to literally anything. Let's take this scorpion here, and you can just start pumping damage straight into this thing. Of course, we've got a primitive one here, but it still is doing hefty amounts of damage at fast rates too, and considering this scorpion is a level 1350, we really can't complain with the fact that it hasn't already killed this thing. It is an amazing weapon, and you know, some people might vastly prefer swords, but I am definitely a pike person when it comes to all of this weaponry, and the pike is really a great one for me, and I use it a heck of a lot, which is why obviously I've chucked it on this list. The pike is just such a great melee weapon, because when creatures get up close, it's always the thing which I turn to first, and of course you can always run away too, but it adds the extra little element of defense which perhaps you wouldn't get from some of the more ranged weapons on this list. Now, my favorite gun in the game has to go to this pump action shotgun. It really just excels above everything else in the department of just getting damage done, because it outputs just so much damage and so many bullets in one go. But it has the added bonus that in third person, this thing reloads 6 times faster than in first person. So it is a fast reloading gun that deals a heck of a lot of damage if all the bullets land. And for that, I love this gun to bits. And the ammo really isn't expensive. It doesn't use 6 ammunition for each shot. It just uses 1, although it does multiple amounts of damage in one go. And again, Ascendant 1 will work leagues above all the rest of the guns which you'd see on this list as well. And for that reason, loads of people use it, and I'm definitely an advocate of using this gun, especially in that third person mode where you can get even more damage dealt. And you can always resort to something like a pike if the creatures get up even more close and personal, but it still does work effectively against close ranged attacks. Perhaps controversially, in at the number 2 spot, I have got the bowler. I just said earlier though, with the net projectiles, that they're better than the bowlers, and while yes, they are better and they can get more creatures under the net, I do think the bowler is still a better item and is more useful, as it is unlocked way sooner and can help so much in the beginning. It's sort of for the same reason that the spear was on the list as well as the pike, although I've decided to put this higher as the bowler is great in PvP scenarios against other players, as of course you can bowler other players too. But it's great for taming pteranodons in the early game or sort of early mid stages of the game, and in the early game offers you a lot of protection against creatures like raptors and dilos, which you may not be able to run away from in some cases. And for that reason, I think the bowler is the second best arc item. It is incredibly useful and it will do leagues for your progress in the early stages. While the net projectile is obviously the upgrade further on, it is far more expensive and you need to be at least level 40, I think, to unlock that and start using it. And, you know, of course, with the expenses, it's not the greatest thing either. That rock really scuffed me up there. But before we get into number 1, I've got this little thing in my hand here, also known as the torch. And while, yes, it's not only just a thing for the night, I think it has some other great uses, namely in the sense of insects. Insects are by far some of the most annoying things in the game, and wouldn't you want a fantastic way to kill them and get rid of them? Well, the torch is your answer. If you simply swing it around, you can see all the insects catch on fire, and this is by far the most effective and cheapest way to get all those insects dead. And I think that is the main reason why this torch deserves the honorable mention. It's not just a thing I use for lighting up my night, and in fact I barely ever do that because gamma commands exist. It is my number 1 insect killer. Again, if you get an Ascendant 1, the durability is much better, but I always carry several torches on me and just whack the hell out of insects whenever they come near me. And a second one broke as well. We'll pretend like that doesn't exist and we'll jump our way into number 1. In the number 1 spot for the best arc item, I think it's pretty obvious. We have got the pick, the hatchet, and the hatchet in both metal and stone variants. Now, some people might say, well, why don't you just put the metal ones on here? Again, the metal ones are far more expensive and you need them later in the game. And obviously the reason why they're here is therefore all your basic essential resources. Now, you can complete arc without any of the other weapons on this list, and in fact, you know, to some extent you could complete arc without these items as well, as you can punch trees to get it. But harvesting any sort of rocks, if you don't have an Anki and you're going to be needing metal for that, which you need a pick to get in the first place, you're going to need one of these things, and you're going to need both of these things really to excel your progress through the game, and no other item is going to do it. Without these things, the game's progression system is broken. They play such a big role in all of it. Obviously, the upgrade path from stone to metal is the natural progression further, but they are both needed to be here, as you really can't start without this one. But this is obviously the better pickaxe, and then same for the hatchets as well. But they're all incredibly essential, and for harvesting things like rocks and getting all of this stuff and metal and getting all of that done in the first place, well, the Anki may be the upgrade path later on. I still think these are the most essential item, as you can't get there in the first place without these tools. So that is it for today's video. With my little goofy character face, I will say goodbye to you all, and I hope that you all had a great time watching this video, and that now you know what my favorite arc items are / weapons, and that perhaps you use these as well. Feel free to leave down below in the comments all your favorite arc items / weapons, 10 preferably, not all of them, that would absolutely flood the chat, but if you want to, then go for it, and make sure to like and subscribe, as we're closing our way to 5,000 subscribers, and I'd love to get there soon. Anyway, bye, and give it up for our patrons, Ekaterina Puchkova and Karina Thorne, Dominic Macy-Jewski, sorry about that name, and everyone else that's on this list. All the people I've mentioned are paid members, and if you feel like that's something you want a shout out at the end of the video, go join the Patreon or become a paid YouTube member.